Hello, everyone, and officially welcome to our fireside chat today with Matt Moscardi from Free Float Media. Our topic today will be Guerrilla ESG and board Sabermetrics. And if that sounds incredibly interesting and, oh my God, what is that? Then you are in the right place because those things are true. Before we dive in, just a very brief word about the fourth floor. For those of you who do not know about us or what we are, the fourth floor is a marketplace. We match startups and companies to board-ready women. We do this in a trusted and efficient and very cost-effective way. We are disrupting the traditional board search process. We're doing that to overcome systemic barriers that have kept women out of the board candidate pipeline. We also match underrepresented founders and fund managers with women angels and LPs in our backroom private investment club. We do this because women, in fact, invest differently than men. And we believe that that difference can unlock incredible wealth into the world. So that's what we're doing there. So if you are listening to this and you are interested in either initiating or maybe advancing a for-profit board career by serving on an advisory board or governing board of an earlier stage company, and you are a woman or you identify as a woman, please consider joining us as a board candidate. If you're interested in investing, please consider joining us as an investor. You can do both those things. If you are a founder and you are seeking talented and diverse mentors, advisors, directors, and funders, then please consider joining us on behalf of your startup. We also have a job board. We have a great community, lots of wonderful programming like this that's accessible on the platform, including a board bootcamp that we do every 6 weeks or so. There's another one coming up May 9th. We'll put the link in the chat. It's a great way to really dive in, whether you're a company or a candidate. And we'll also share our weekly platform tour, which is a wonderful way as a first step if you're interested in joining us to learn more, see the platform, and then you have to apply. So all that information we're sharing. Enough about the fourth floor. Let's get to the topic at hand. So to introduce this topic and to introduce Matt, I think it's great to ask everyone here whether or not you have ever wondered which individual director might be, say, most responsible for carbon emissions over the course of their career. Or maybe you just wonder, you have a hunch and a suspicion which director might have the biggest personality and just command the room, no matter how good they actually are. Well, we have wondered about those things at the fourth floor, and thankfully, so has Matt Moscardi at Free Float Media. And in fact, Matt has devoted years to asking and answering these questions. So that's as much of an intro as I'm going to give for you, Matt, because now I want you to take it and I want you to introduce yourself in your own words. Give us your backstory. How did you get started on this path?
So first, hi, everybody. I'm Matt. So I was at MSCI for 10 years. We did ESG data and analytics. My co-founder, Damian Rollis, was at GMI and then MSCI. He did governance work. And we spent a lot of time asking questions about like why governance, why it was okay, for instance, that Mark Zuckerberg has dual class shares and investors are okay with that. Why does anybody join the board of Meta or Facebook? Because they don't have any power, really. We were always interested in that dynamic. So we left MSCI 4 years ago. And we started a snarky daily ESG adjacent podcast. And as part of that process, we covered the Boeing MAX 8 stories. And we wanted to answer the question, not who was on the board that greenlit it, but how that board got together. And look, long story short, and we can get into the details of it, we ended up in a place where we found out the head of the nominating committee was directly connected. His clients, 66% of the Boeing board were his clients of his lobbying firm. And it shocked us. And we thought, well, is that the guy who's calling the shots? And then we ended up getting 200,000 directors' data points and built a model to identify who's calling the shots. And for us, it was like content in reality driving analytics. And we spent years sort of asking these questions that I don't know if we've answered, but we started to. So now we've got it. But one of the things that we noticed, and the things that we'll talk about today, is where the center of powers are, how they get constituted, and what it means, what you can do about it. Because I think anecdotally, we all feel like there's a system and it's skewed in some way. But it's really hard to figure out how and why. And we're trying to answer that with numbers, with like real world numbers.
Okay, love that. And also, one thing that you mentioned when we were talking about this was you started to realize patterns about how people are focusing on companies instead of people. So, like when you're saying it's so hard to find out what actually is going on, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that. How to divorce the individual from the corporation, and just, how that confusion factors into our lack of understanding about what actually is going on with boards.
Yeah, I mean, the short history lesson is, and I think a lot of people on this call may know it, the limited liability corporation has existed since it was passed, at least in the UK Parliament, in like 1880s or something, right? It divorces humans from the corporation purposefully. It says you cannot sue the director for the actions of the companies in many cases. In some cases you can, but in many cases what it does is it doesn't allow you to go after, you're you start a company, you take out some debt in the name of the company. They can't like put your mom in jail because you can't repay your debt, which they used to be able to do. They do that to foster innovation. You do that so that I can take risk, create something, and it can fail. That allows for innovation to accelerate. But it also has an unintended consequence where I am no longer necessarily feel responsible. I can say the company's responsible, right? So the penultimate example of this is sort of with Enron, right? Like for the accounting scandals at Enron, the entity, becomes like a governance parable in which they are hiding in shell companies throughout Enron. It's a couple of executives making choices on behalf of Enron. Enron fails. Tens of thousands of people lose their jobs, their retirement funds, and only a couple of people end up you try to help hold them accountable. One of the things that the governance community started asking was, who's responsible? After Enron collapsed, we started asking the question, who's responsible when things go wrong? Like how can we backtrack a little bit on the idea of a limited liability company and say, well, you have to have some liability, because the externalities now are massive fraud or accounting scandals that bring down markets, climate change, right? Like that's an externality that has to do with, we don't have a who, right? Like we say Exxon's responsible, but Exxon is actually a collective of human beings. Over the last 30 years, it's been executives and board members making decisions. And we don't know who those people are. We just say Exxon's responsible. So a lot of what we did, and this includes like Silicon Valley Bank. We're talking about bank runs now, 2008 financial crisis. It comes down to a lot of questions about who. A lot of what we did is attempting to put who back in financial markets, and even if they're not liable, measuring who they are or giving you their names.
Right. No, again, I was just about to ask you about Silicon Valley Bank, so glad that you just mentioned that. And okay, one other thing about your background and just kind of what got you into this. Like, this was not, my understanding is that you weren't motivated by a desire to say, make the economic case for diversity or anything like that. This was more, it was more of an academic exercise, right? So maybe speak a little bit about how you were approaching this.
Well, when I was at MSCI, we used to make the economic case for diversity. But the things that you find out are relatively shocking, right? Like we did a study at MSCI where we looked at women in finance, and we wanted to, rather than saying like there aren't a lot of women in finance at executive levels, which is obvious, right? You can just count. We wanted to say, well, what's the number of women in finance relative to the talent available, right? Like, so let's say tertiary educated people with economics degrees, country by country, for instance, and then take every single bank and say, do the people in that bank represent where they operate? And what we found was, that 90% of banks do a really good job of hiring women at junior levels, for instance. But as soon as you get to senior levels, 75% of them, there you have less talent than you would expect, less female talent than you would expect. We were making the economic case at MSCI, looking at things like that and saying, okay, the economic case is you've limited your talent pool. Since we left, right? To us, it's more, I wouldn't call it academic. I'd call it real world implications, right? Like we want to understand the real world implications of how you constitute teams and what you want those teams to do. We named it Board Sabermetrics because it's named after sports analytics, because we think of boards as teams. And in the real world, teams don't function well. The academics bear this out when they're non-diverse, when there's groupthink involved. So backstopping a lot of our data, what we built, is 30 or 40 academic pieces, everything from how boards work, social situations, how people work in teams or work in groups, in diverse cohorts. We even did primatology research. We looked at how apes choose alpha, an alpha male or female, because we're not that far removed. And when you put all that together and you look at a board in that context, say like, how's this team work? Who chooses the alpha? There's a lot of academic research sort of backstopping that thinking now, so that we know a lot more and we still make the same stupid mistakes. And that's part of what we're trying to avoid.
Right, and that is very human. That's probably the most quintessential human thing there is. Okay, so let's talk more about data in this context. So like the guts and the gears of getting someone on the board at the public level, like what does that entail? So really walk us through those different data points.
All right, so there's a lot of data on companies, and there's even a lot of data on boards and structures and things like that. There's actually not a lot of data on the people. There's a lot of there's some unstructured data on the people, but there's not a lot. So what we did, right? Well, think of it like this. What do we know, right? We know what someone writes down in their resume. So we can tell whether they have advanced degrees or whether they were CEOs before, or the companies they worked at before. So we know that. We can pull some of that data. We know a lot of times we know their gender is usually self-identified, and we can glean it using pronouns if it's not actually disclosed. There's a lot of like little ancillary data we know, but one of the things that we built was we wanted to know who people know, right? Like, because one of the big things about constituting a board, and this is, we talk about this all the time, it doesn't matter if you have your PhD from MIT and you're the most qualified person on the topic that company sort of looks at. More often than not, it's who you know. That's what gets you in. So we did a network analysis of boards. We said, let's take 250,000 board members for 10,000 publicly traded companies. We added in executives, another 40,000 of those. We added in some private companies. There's hundreds of thousands of those, but we can't get data on all of them. Where we get the data, we can add some in. And let's find out who's connected to who. You can measure a network, the number of degrees from one person to another. Think of it like Kevin Bacon, right? 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. What is it? 7 degrees? 6, 5? I don't remember. I think it's 6, right? You can do that with board members. And it turns out, actually, with board members, 6 degrees can get you from like a US large cap company to like an Indian small cap company. The number of degrees isn't that big. I think the total network size is 27 degrees for all directors at all publicly traded companies in the entire world. So that is not a huge network. But what we wanted to map how people get put in that room. And more often than not, like the Ken Duberstein example, it's the head of the nominating committee or the most powerful person in a boardroom, who they know is who gets circulated. Often it's management, right? But who they know or who they've been connected with, we can usually find them in their network and say, oh, that's where they got them from. And a lot of boards get constituted that way. And then once they're in the room, the other data points are like, okay, now how are they going to operate? Are they going to look to that person who put them there and say, oh, I definitely don't want to say no to them. They gave me this job that's $200,000 a year to show up 12 times. Or is there an incentive, like, or a structure that's different in place? Is it a democratic board? Are you the only person with like cybersecurity expertise on a board of like a tech company? In which case, when there's a data breach, everyone's going to look at you, right? And then you have some power. Those are the data points we look for, and we have a lot of them. We have probably 20 to 30 data points for every director in the world, and 200,000 of them. You're talking about millions of data points in order to like understand how they work together.
Okay, amazing. One thing that we frequently talk about when we talk about boards, and we're really focused in the private sector, but we talk about that statistic of 85% of any available board opportunity, whether it's with a private company or with a public company, is not being seeded through a recruiter. So what that means is that 85% of any of these opportunities are word of mouth, which is exactly what you're saying, which is why that network is 27, because that is how the vast majority of everyone is ending up sitting in that seat. So
I mean, on the private side, that's definitely true. On the public side, I actually think it's more insidious in a way, in which you hire a recruiter, but you give them effectively a short list. There's no possible way that, like, when we look at the board of something like Abbott Labs, right? The board of Abbott Labs, it's a Chicago-based company. It was run by Miles Waite for over 20 years. He was the CEO and chair. When I look at their board, we can connect all of them within 2 degrees of one another almost instantaneously. But they go out and they refresh board members every year to 2 or 3 years, right? So how do you keep a constant group of people that look new but aren't? They always hire a recruiter, right? Like, because they have to disclose, what they're doing, and they have to look like they're doing their due diligence. But if you hand the recruiter, I want them based in Chicago, I want them to have worked for a large cap company, and preferably they're on the board of some charity, and it would be nice if they were a woman, but or a person of color, so that we can fill that role, right? Then you're only choosing from a very small cohort. The search firms know what you're looking for. You're looking for the person you had a martini with at the gala for the art museum, right? Like, that's often the way it works behind the veil of like hiring a search firm. Not always, but often enough that if we can connect it that fast, it's hard to believe. I'd be hard pressed to believe that that's like, we're just getting independent people and just stacking the board with them.
No, that is an excellent point. So thank you for making that. Okay, so let's dive into this idea of influence on boards, because this is part of, so you give us this background, there's all this different data that you've managed to identify that you're analyzing. A lot of it relates to the network of these individuals. So what about now the primal, the alpha? So this idea of influence, is it the person that is the reason why you're in that room, and then you're kowtowing to that person? Are there other characteristics or traits connected to influence that you're tracking? Maybe just dive into that.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to understand it, so we use like buckets of data. Like, we use resume data, we use status, whether or not you're like a large shareholder or an insider or an activist put you there, or family member. We use roles, like, are you the chair of a committee, or are you kind of like just a member of the audit committee and no one really wants to hear what you have to think? And we use that social network. We use like these big buckets of data. We construct it mathematically. We have a model that built off of sports models to construct our estimation of influence. But think of it instead as your personal experience in a room full of people. Think of like the person who raises their hand the most or just shouts out an answer, right? Like, who is that person? What do they look like? If I say that and you close your eyes, 99% of the people on the call can picture someone in their head, right?
Well, anyone who's a lawyer that's listening to this, that's the gunner. So
right.
We know.
You know who that person is. And often you know who that person is before you even get into the room. And think of the attributes that person has. It's either political attributes. Some of them, you've probably worked with people who are like have multiple degrees and talk about it all the time. They talk about all the degrees that they have. That you might work with somebody who like they are an owner of the company, or a part owner, or a partner at a company, or founder, or something like that. And you know that what you're saying, if you say something dissenting, they're going to take it personally, because it's their company, they're an owner, they're a founder, whatever the case may be. You can actually think of social dynamics and say, oh, well, if I had to say in any given meeting that I'm ever in, the percentage of that meeting that I control, and if you're really honest with yourself, how high is that percentage? We're using the same exact sort of calculus with buckets of data. When you look around and you say like, oh, that person went to an Ivy League school and I didn't. Like, if that has cachet where you are, that matters. That person is an owner. That person knows everyone else in the room, but I'm an outsider, right? We can measure those things. We can't measure them perfectly, but we can approximate a lot of them. So when we're done, we use these 4 big buckets of data, and we have data points across all of them. And we have a model that effectively says, how many other directors in that room are you beating with your cachet on one of these things? And when we're done with this process, we end up with, if there's 100% of decision-making power in your committee, in your board, what percentage do you get? And that's how we slice and dice it.
Okay. So the algorithm that you're talking about, or, taking all this data and then coming up with a mathematical model, that really has to do with mapping these attributes together with that social cachet that the person has based on all of these various, bits about their life and their experience that you've assigned weight to, that has a rational basis. And then that's going to spit out a score. And then that score is what you can attach to all of these sitting directors at public companies.
So it's more organic than that, right? Like, everything's contextual. We try not to do a score. We try to actually think of it as like a percentage of power, right? Like, and so there's no score, but you can only ever have 100%. Like, you can walk into a room and everyone there could be totally meaningless except for you, right? But every company is different, and the cachet at every company is different, and the dynamics of every company is different. And it's not the company that's different, it's the people that get populated in that room. You could be in a room full of 5 directors of small cap companies, and you're the only one who ever worked at, and you're a director from Apple. That's your other directorship. That carries a tremendous amount of weight in that situation. But you take that same sort of like pool of people and you make them all large cap directors, and they don't care anymore that you work at Apple and because they're at some other one. Everything ends up being contextual depending on who's in the room. So what we spit out is basically we measure the context, and then we spit out, like, given this context, who's the likely decision makers, and that's it.
Okay, so essentially an individual could have one score in one room or sitting around one board table, and then that same individual could have a totally different score in a different context. So it's 100%. Not to the person, it's linked. Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
I mean, we feel that in real life, right? Like, if you send me into like a volleyball camp and expect me to like know what I'm talking about, I'm not going to. But you sit me down in front of like me and you talking about boards, and all of a sudden, like, I'm feeling good, like I got it, I'll raise my hand. So it's built on that context, like a real life context.
Right. Okay. So that makes a ton of sense. So now maybe you can talk a little bit about what you see in the data. So, now we understand like how you are kind of arriving at this percentage power score that people have that's very contextualized in a particular boardroom. But then what does that mean? What can you extrapolate out from it? And I think you used the phrase moneyballing directors. Maybe you could speak about that a bit more.
So if you're a baseball fan or a sports fan, Moneyball is the idea that you can use stats to constitute your team effectively. And it used to be money. They called it Moneyball because the teams that did it had no money, and they were trying to find like hidden statistics, hidden value in players that were otherwise cheap. Now, in this context, Moneyball is really about, can we measure the performance? Do we have stats on the performance of directors? Look, the bulk, when you look at your pension fund or your retirement accounts or your stock fund, anything. You own some stock. You'd usually get a vote with that stock. The vast majority of that publicly traded stock that you're voting on, the votes that you have are for directors. The things you know about the directors are generally their names and their bios. There's an average 96% for vote for directors. Institutions do almost no due diligence on the directors because they can't. They try, but they can't. There's 80,000 of those votes a year globally that have to happen on directors for the most part, right? What we try to do is tell you, A, who the decision maker is, and we just talked about that. But B, once you know, if Breen, you own 20% of the board power, then you own 20% of the outcomes of the decisions of that board. Once you have the power, we can say you own the outcomes. So now we're in a position where you're on a board for 5 years. Each year you own a different percentage of the power influence based on the dynamics, changing dynamics of the board every single year. Say that company is really good at earnings. We can say you own some percentage of being really good at earnings. And over your career, over a longer period of time, we can start to ascribe performance to you. We can say, given the power you have on that board, here's how well you do. We call it a batting average. We actually create effectively a batting average, and we can do it over any number of metrics. But it allows you to say, is my board actually any good? They get a 96% for vote. Are they better than 96% of other directors? Or are they basically average? Because by definition, like you can't get 96% of people to agree that like there was a moon landing, but we can agree on directors. By definition, someone's got to be average out there. There's 9,000 companies, someone's average. So what we're trying to do is strip out the sort of biases in the way we measure directors. And I know we're going to talk about gender and bias next, because the shocking part is when you do that, you've gotten rid of all of the arguments about who should be on the board and why, because you're looking more specifically at who is on the board and how they actually did. You're now in a place to say, all right, well, your performance kind of sucks. Why are you still on this board? And there stops being a good excuse for why you're on that board, other than, well, I know Jerry, he put me here, or I'm friends with the portfolio manager who votes me in, right? You start to get rid of this sort of like the shadowy veil of how are these people here?
And so this concept of moneyballing directors and assigning not only this power and influence score, but then also a performance metric score that would attach to an individual, right, regardless of context, is part of the goal of that score to be able to assemble a dream team? Is this?
I mean, I don't think it's ever really going to happen. Although tomorrow on our podcast, on Thursday on our podcast, we're going to, as a joke, do exactly that. We're going to draft directors and see if we can assemble some sort of dream teams. But that's not the point. I think that not everyone can be a dream team. What you want to know, if you're an investor, what you want to know is where your risk is. You want to know, who should I vote out? Is there somebody here who stinks at something I wish they were good at? Is this team assembled right or close to right? And then if you're a person or you're trying to get on the boards, or you're engaging, you're another stakeholder, you might be asking different questions, which is like, how do you still have a job when you're mediocre at it? When I get fired when I'm mediocre at my job, right? Like there's a lot of questions you can answer with this. And our institutional investor clients are actually looking at this data, and they're asking lots of different questions, like, well, this board is highly totalitarian, right? Like, as in all the influence is consolidated with one person, or maybe it's an oligopoly, or like two people control all the influence. That's not okay for me, right? Like, as an investor, I want a more democratic board. I feel more comfortable with that. Maybe it's about diversity. Maybe you're saying like, I have diversity on this board, but I want that diversity to have more power, right? How do I engage and do that? It's not always a dream team. It's just a team and team performance. And we're at the beginnings of understanding what team performance looks like on corporate boards, which is shocking because we've known how LeBron James and Michael Jordan performed forever. Like as soon as there were sports, there were stats about sports. We know how good they are. And we cannot name a director. If I gave you a board Target, you probably couldn't name one director on the Target board, and you might shop there 3 times a week. That disconnect is what we're trying to close. Like, so you can say these people are good or bad or not even trying to get to dream team yet, but it's not a bad idea.
Right. No, I love this analogy because I think everyone instinctually understands that a sports team, it's a collection of individual humans. People don't necessarily understand a company as a collection of individual humans, which was, how we started this discussion talking about Enron and, the corporate veil and where the blame sits. So I think that's a really powerful analogy, and it does feel like it makes a lot of sense. Okay, to get back to economic case for diversity, I'm just wondering, when you come up with this calculus, this performance metric for directors, where does diversity factor in? I mean, does it factor in? But the fact that that individual maybe comes from a different background and has different perspective, does that affect this performance metric score?
So no, right? Like we don't care about what we care about is the power and then the performance relative to that power. So one of the things to understand about diversity and the questions around diversity, we know we'll read headlines all the time, publicly traded boards, the S&P 500, I think it's like 29% or 30% of board members are women or identify as women. We know the percentage that identify, we have data through a partner where we know denominator. We know the percentage that are white, Asian, Middle Eastern, Black, and Hispanic, right? Like we actually have some diversity data, and we can tell you the percentage of bodies in that room that are diverse. The shocking thing that we find is when you look at the power that diversity has, there's a lot of pressure on an S&P 500 board to have a diverse cohort. You cannot be an S&P 500 board that's all male, all white. Not anymore. 10 years ago, maybe. 15 years ago, definitely. Today, no. Today, it's minimum of a woman and a person of color. That's the minimum. And we see that. And boards the companies tout that. Every company you go to has a diversity page. They talk about inclusion, talk about championing inclusion. And I was just looking at a company earlier today, Cooper. They do like medical devices. I was doing research for something else. And I noticed on their page, 50% of their board is women. And there's one person of color, 8-person board, 50% women. Cooper has one of the largest power gaps, and this is the concept that we're working on, of any company in the S&P 500. So while 50% of the people in the room are women, here's how you control the power. Don't give them any committee assignments. Make sure they're all new or you refresh them often. Make sure that they're well connected to you, to the CEO, to the power center, so that the person that brings you in is, someone you're beholden to. Make sure you give yourself structural advantages, like be an insider at the company or have dual class shares. Like Mark Zuckerberg can afford to populate his entire company he could have a board that was 100% Black women, and it wouldn't matter. He has 51% of the voting power. Doesn't matter. Like what he says is the only thing that matters. And when you measure power relative to representation, that's when you start to get into interesting questions of what did we do with this question of diversity? Did we solve something? Because I think the point you're getting at with asking about diversity and how it affects performance is we want different outcomes with teams that we're assembling. We don't want to see the same outcomes all the time. We want to consider other stakeholders, other issues. We want better performance. We want less groupthink. But you don't achieve that if the power centers remain exactly the same as they currently are. And some of the worst places we see this is in places where there are quotas. There are quotas for women on boards. If we did a study earlier this year, and in Scandinavia, and like Norway, for instance, they have a quota of 40% women on publicly traded boards. and it's mandated. And the biggest power gap in the world, on the average power gap, is in Scandinavia and Norway. So what we've done is we've mandated the fact that you need more representation, but we didn't mandate that they get any power. So all the power centers are exactly the same, and all the outcomes are largely the same. And that flies against the research about groupthink and dissent and social dynamics and how those things actually work and why they matter. I mean, the Department of Energy has an entire chapter about groupthink and how it's a grave risk for the United States. That's been in their handbook for 20 or 30 years. It's not something we didn't know about. But when you look at the data on corporate boards, what we see is it exists, and it exists. It's a problem. I mean, it's everywhere.
Right. Okay. So to let that, it is such a, I don't know, it's so insidious, you know, it's a really powerful point. I think it's, in some ways, it can be a hard point to digest, right? This concept that while quotas might be incredibly valuable and important and part of the change, but it's not enough in a vacuum. That if you're really, really looking to objective bits of data that can be analyzed and tracked, because of this power gap in the room that's contextual, just because there is diversity sitting around the table, it doesn't necessarily mean the company is seeing the economic benefit of that diversity, if that diversity
exactly
doesn't have the voice.
That's exactly right. And such is not to say, because sort of a point came in on the chat about representation being the first step. 100%, no representation, there's no diversity at all, right? Like, that is the first barrier, getting into the room. But there's a difference between getting into the room, how you get into the room, and having power in that room, having authority in that room. I was offered a job once where and this is like deep white male privilege perspective, so take it or leave it. But I was offered a job once that like tripled my salary. And my ask, because I was enough of an asshole to ask this, was, you can cut that salary in half if you put me in the room where the decision gets made. I do not care if I don't get to make the decision. And that is what we're trying to measure in some respects with the data that we have. Because what we find on the performance angle for even the representation that we have, women, diverse cohorts on average perform exactly the same as their male counterparts on boards. Exactly the same. Their batting averages are exactly the same. Pick a performance metric. It's uniformly the same, with one exception, which is controversial business activity, which we have a batting average for. So companies that are more controversial, more oil spills, you know, talc in your baby powder, or, you know, whatever controversy du jour is. Women have a noticeable difference in that they're way better at avoiding controversy than men are. Everything else is almost exactly the same. So we're not talking about women not being qualified. We're not talking about, you know, women on average, 68% of women on the S&P 500 boards have advanced degrees compared to 61% of their male counterparts. We're not talking about women, you know, who like they're all token. There are women who are incredibly powerful on some of these boards, and they perform equally as well as their male counterparts. We're talking about a system. We're talking about a system of choosing that leads you to a place where you haven't eradicated groupthink. You haven't increased diversity to change your outcomes. You haven't eradicated the groupthink that's existed for 30 years. We've achieved what is step one, which is opening the door in a lot of places, but not what is end goal, which is having the voice.
It's just so fascinating. It's really amazing. Okay, so one thing, so you talked a little bit about some trends you've been able to see when it comes to gender and race because of this moneyballing of directors. Is there, are there other trends? And, you know, is there more to say on that point?
I mean, there's one other one that we found in our data, and it sort of made us feel worse in a way. But so when we look at power and we look at across not just gender diversity, but ethnic or racial diversity, using the denominator data, the trend that we found was that representation, well, I'll say it this way. women across all cohorts have a power gap. Women are the only cohort that gets a power gap. If you're a Black male, a Hispanic male, a Caucasian male, an Asian male, Middle Eastern male, your power on average is generally commensurate with your representation on average. So if there's 50% of the board is white men, they on average get about 56% of the power. They get a little bit more because obviously white men, but on average, the race and ethnicity actually isn't a deterrent to your power. The only factor that we found that was identifying female. Across every cohort, women had a power gap, and the worst, and I mean worst by far, was being a Black woman. Being a Black woman means you may have 20% representation, but on average you get 5% of the power. It's a massive, massive power gap. Those are the trends that we're finding. I mean, amongst others, there's a tremendous amount of data that we have and that we're constantly going through. And we're finding all sorts of things all the time. And our clients and our partners are finding things in our data that we don't even know to look for. But when it comes to sort of gender and diversity, usually it's about the power gap, and we find no differences about outcomes necessarily. Like there's no outcome gap that says, oh, if you have more women or more people of color, you do worse. What we find is just power stays consolidated.
Wow, that last point just really packs a punch. That's really, really incredible. And I have to say, that feels right to me.
I mean, it probably gels with a lot of not like people's experiences. And I'll interrupt myself. There's a question about shifting the conversation, because when you're talking about this data and the sort of power gaps and things like that, and we've built indices, lists of companies where there are no power gaps or like positive power gaps. We can actually use this data to show not just who's doing the worst and where the averages are bad, but to reconstitute the S&P 500 and say, like, let me flip this on its head and say, if I'm investing, how do I invest in a team that represents me or has less groupthink? So there are ways to to move to action, because I know we want to talk about action. But the question is about policy and using this data to sort of change or shift policy or shift the conversation. And I will say this anecdotally, like the diversity minister of Denmark got a hold of our data when they heard that there was that big of a power gap. I think there are people who are very interested in shifting the conversation and understanding how their markets really work, not as a collection of companies. And, we read about company lays off so-and-so, or, the Dow's up, 20 points today or whatever, but as a collection of people who make those decisions and understanding how those decisions get made, who's making them, uncovering that, and whether we're okay with that being the groups. I don't know that we're ever going to get to a place where we say, you need to have one person of color on your board, one woman on your board, and they have to have a chair role. Like, I don't think we're ever going to get there, but I do think we shift the conversation with our dollars. Like, I do think as an investor, you have a vote. 90% of retail investors don't vote. Institutions vote, retail investors don't. That's everyone knows that. And it's funny because the float for most companies is in retail hands. It's usually in our hands, and we don't vote. It's the alternative democracy that no one uses, but we could, right? The way to shift the conversation is to invest differently, is to approach differently, is to ask different questions. Show up at a shareholder meeting, or ask a question on a shareholder meeting. Get in touch with a gadfly who files proxy statements, and see if you can get on the proxy yourself. Put it up for a shareholder vote. I think there are apps who do this. We've been talking to some people who run these apps that actually are trying to coalesce retail investors to action. But there are ways to shift the conversation. It generally has to do, it's less likely to do with policy, although that's one avenue. It's more likely to do with your money.
Right. No, it makes a ton of sense. I mean, even if there can be some movements on the policy front, which, get people in the room or, create quotas, that, as we've just talked about, unfortunately, that might not be enough by itself. But then the market solution, right? Various market solutions, that's where they become so incredible. Like you said, there are people out there that care about this, even if their motivation is not because they care about equity or because they don't want all the power to be with white men, but just because they want to make more money. So if they understand these dynamics better and they can have risk adjusted decision making, be at peak performance levels, then all of this becomes super relevant, and then that can dictate what companies they're investing in based on this moneyballing of directors, like who's sitting around the table. I mean, so that, like, just hearing you tell this narrative, that seems clear. And then of course, I think this other thing you're talking about, this retail power, right? The power of the purse. I mean, each of us individually, we can decide not to spend our money, with certain companies for certain reasons.
Well, I mean, I'm generally an advocate of, to some degree, I think, like, I'm not a boycotter that much, right? Like the conservative movement, the anti-woke movement is in full boycott mode with Anheuser-Busch now and running over Bud Lights and shooting cans of Bud Lights. I saw one guy light his whiskey on fire because they went woke. That to me is like can have power en masse, but is generally it's a harder and poorer way to power. I think the people on a call like this are generally people of means, generally people who have had careers, who are established, who have some measure of power in the worlds in which they operate. I actually think that leveraging the power that you do have, the vote that you do have, the investor dollar is way more powerful than the consumer dollar in many cases. You can bring down countries. I mean, it's famous examples of, like, who the North getting backed in the Civil War, right, by bonds, like the Rockefellers choosing, politicians and presidents, and like there are famous examples in the past of very powerful people with investor dollars, through bonds or stocks or whatever, access to capital, making change. And that is not new. There you have the ESG movement was born out of the socially responsible investment movement, which was effectively people with religious beliefs or moral beliefs voting with their investor dollars in a different way. It was, you needed data to do it, right? And the great boon to sort of the world was, these are people who said, hey, I don't want to invest in this. Do you do that? Can you disclose it? And that gets more and more and more data flowing. And then we have all the data, we can make just different decisions with it. But that movement, that thought process of, you know what, I maybe forget, you could be morally opposed, you could be morally for, you could be economically opposed, economically for. You have a thesis of the world, a way that you think it should look. Your investor dollar is arguably the strongest dollar that people in this room might have to go out and say, in my portfolio, I am not going to hold this company, or I am, and I'm going to change them. And that's what I'm going to do. Like we see it all the time. Go out and buy McDonald's stock because you hate McDonald's, and then piss them off by voting and coalescing your friends to vote against everything they want you to vote for. Switch their directors out, vote them out, vote, on shareholder proposals, write a shareholder proposal, ask for things. That's what you can do in the alternative democracy. And I think that's really powerful. I think that's arguably more powerful than like avoiding shopping for Clorox products, because which I'm not against, but I think it's not the lever that you can, that the more powerful lever that you can use. Okay.
And who is using these levers right now? Like, there are people out there that are doing this, right? And I know there's an example that pops into my mind, maybe motivated, very different motivations they're pursuing, but they're doing something very similar.
I mean, there are a lot. Who's your example? Because I have lots and lots.
I'm thinking of Vivek.
Yeah. Woke Inc.
Yeah.
Vivek Ramaswamy, he was on our show for like 2 weeks before he announced he was running for president. He came on our show and we got in a debate. And it was actually a debate about women CEOs. If you want to see, I hope he makes a great presidential run, because I'll have to dig up our episode with him in which he uses critical race theory to describe why there aren't a lot of women who are CEOs today, right? Like, it's a very funny, weird, he was like outraged about a thing and then used CRT to, anyway. Yes, he is using but he's not using a new tactic. He's using the tactic that nuns and and Catholics and Islamic investors and Quakers, investors, particularly religious investors, but anti-apartheid investors, investors across the world have been using this method to change companies. The reason why you have a woke company conversation now is because investors who are generally more liberal have been pushing for more and more and more data and disclosure and change for the last 20 years. They've been doing it for a really long time. They still haven't. The reason why you see as many women on the board as you do now is because of efforts 25, 30 years ago of people saying you can't have a board of all white men, right? Like and those investor votes have accrued over time. Really what's accrued is data. And then it became easier and easier for institutions like BlackRock and State Street and Fidelity, who on average, the big Vanguard, the big four own on average something like 20% of every company. Like it becomes easier for them to vote differently when the data is out there.
Right. And I guess part of my point of mentioning, like if there are, say, really far right-wing motivated actors and funds that are out there trying to, play in this alternative democracy that you're describing and affect corporations in the way that's to their benefit, but the other side of the spectrum is maybe slower to the game, or is less inclined, isn't necessarily playing hardball in the same way. Like it's important to know who's out there doing this, like who is taking advantage of the those proxy rights and are making boards, are flexing their muscles, like who's out there flexing and who should be flexing their muscles.
And there are funds today that are flexing their muscles on different things. Like Engine Number One, for instance, came to prominence because they managed to coalesce a number of pension fund investors around changing Exxon's board to add more forward-minded environmental directors. Now, not all, but several of the board members they added. They won. It was a big deal like 2 years ago because they owned 0.5% of the shares. They were not an activist. They were not like some massive fund. They were just a little fund with an idea, and they managed to get all these pension funds on board to change the face of Exxon's board, right? They added a number of directors, not even just one. It was 3 or 4. They added a lot. Now, that is possible because Engine Number One sells an ETF, an investable market index that you can go buy as a retail investor, and they pool all the dollars that the people who invest in their ETF have, and they just buy the S&P 500 and then engage with the companies. They spend all their time calling up and saying, like, this is what we want. This is the board. This is the way we want them to look. We want you to think about environmental issues. We want to add more climate change experts to boards. That's their thing. Those funds exist. They exist on both the left and the right. Doesn't matter your value set. You can get that. At the center of all of it is data. And that's what we do, right? Like we don't come to market and say like boards should look away. We say this is how they do look and this is how they do perform. And if that's not okay with you, then change it. And one of the things that we work on, we build lists, like I said, we built our own list of like women powered boards, not women representation boards, women powered boards. So companies where women hold the power, the majority of power. And there aren't a lot of them, but we can make the lists and we can organize the universe in a different way. We can hand that out to people and say, if you want your portfolio to be more female powered, here's a way to do it, right?
Oh,
There's a
that's
lot of
so
companies who do that.
And where can people listening find that list, for instance? Like, are those published on your website?
So we don't have them published yet. Like the lists are like, we give them to clients sort of behind the scenes, but we are launching a web app in days, less than a week, and it will have all the board members on it, and you can sign up for free, and we're going to be all sorts of lists on there, including what I'm talking about. And that's a matter of days. But if you want it in the interim, you can always just hit me on LinkedIn. We have it. I mean, these are things that are crazy to.
That's amazing. No, that's amazing. And yeah, it's really, really cool. And I guess like just top of mind, is there any surprises when it comes to well-known companies that actually are, women led in terms of women having influence?
Some, look, I'm not going to lie. It's not many, right? If you're talking about like the large companies, are still mostly male dominated. Like we generate a list. Like if I do if I'm looking at the list, like, you probably know AMD, right? AMD is the chip company. They are one of few like S&P 500 companies with a female CEO who has the vast majority of the power on that board. That exists. It's not that it doesn't exist. It's just rare, right? Like where they have a positive gender power gap. General Motors, Mary Barra. She's the CEO and chair of General Motors. She's also on several other boards. She's a power broker. She flits between companies. There are these power boards that are out there. But I'm not going to lie, there's not a lot of them. And when you expand globally, the percentage gets more and more dismal. The smaller the companies are, the worse it gets. The farther you go, when you get into like India, Korea, Japan's horrible. Japan had quotas to put women on boards, and they did the bare minimum to add someone who said they were a woman on the board, and that was all they were willing to do. So there are places in the world where it's really, really bad.
Yeah, well, I believe it. And of course, very core to the mission of the fourth floor, we're really focused on the black box that is the private sector. So, obviously there's lots and lots of issues in the public arena. At least you have that data. At least we're having this conversation. In the private sector, we're not having this conversation because we don't have the data. So, so anyway, I hope that changes.
Well, I would say there is some data in the private sector, and it's worse. And we know that the way funding gets allocated. I mean, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know, but I think there is a myth of the trajectory of board members. And you and I have talked about this, right? Like where you get on a private board and eventually you're qualified enough, you have enough experience, and maybe at some point you get on a publicly traded board, which are all bigger. And I'm going to be honest, there's fucking used car salesmen on public company boards. Like, that's why I talk about like the network. And there was just a story we covered on the show the other day that, golfing, like women don't get to golf as much because they tend to take on caregiver roles, and therefore they're left out of the networking opportunities that lead to more power, right? There's all sorts of stuff like that. And when you realize like the trajectory of being on a private board is you don't need more qualifications to be on the public boards, I guess is the point. What we see, and there was a question about like, do we see any differences in the data about age or education and things like that? What we see is women tend to be younger and women tend to be smarter. That's what we see on publicly traded boards, which suggests to me that men are just held to a lower standard. Like we just always were on the board, so we don't really need to prove ourselves, right? Like we just take the board role because I golfed with the guy who put the board together. That to me is the bigger barrier. Public, private, the data is largely the same from what we know.
Unfortunately, that also feels right to me, that women are held to a different standard. And I'm sure it does to the people on this call as well. And unfortunately, it is 1 minute after 1 o'clock, which it's been so riveting. I meant to come back to you with your final takeaway, but now we are over time. So luckily, everything you say is a final takeaway in that respect. So I think we have one. Thank you for this conversation, Matt. It's just truly so fascinating, and can't wait for your app to go live. We'll be sure to share with the fourth floor, whatever bits of this we can make accessible and share, and we'll keep this conversation going. So hopefully this is the first of many conversations. Thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you, Matt, for this.
Thank you, Breen. Thanks, everybody.